We have to protect the reputation of the Oak Ridge Vista. Sir, you must understand we can't just allow people who look like they walked out of a shelter to sit in our lobby." The voice belonged to Gerald, the regional supervisor of the hotel, but the words did not hang in the air with the authority he so desperately wanted them to carry. Instead, they seemed to fall flat against the massive mahogany table of the top-floor executive boardroom, dying in the quiet space before they could even reach the man sitting at the other end. It was 8:02 on a Thursday morning, and the boardroom was suffocating. The large glass windows offered a sweeping panoramic view of the city skyline, but inside, the air was heavy with the smell of expensive wood polish, cold leather, and the distinct, unmistakable odor of panic. The early morning light cut through the room in pale, sharp shafts, illuminating the fine dust motes drifting in the air and reflecting off the polished surface of the table like light off still water. 6 high-level executives sat in a row along the right side of the table, their bodies rigid, their foreheads glistening with a thin sheen of sweat that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. They looked like men who had spent the last several hours realizing they had built their careers on a foundation of sand and that the tide was currently coming in. Gerald stood near the center of the room, his hands trembling so violently that he had to grip the back of a leather chair to keep them steady. Every few seconds, his fingers would fly to his neck, desperately attempting to adjust his silk tie, which suddenly felt far too tight. His collar was damp, and his eyes darted nervously from the silent figure at the head of the table to the door, searching for an exit that did not exist. Beside him, Brandon, the front desk clerk, was a ghost of a man. His standard-issue Navy uniform, usually pressed to a crisp, sharp edge, looked slightly rumpled. He stared fixedly at the floor, his head lowered, his skin a pale, sickly color under the fluorescent lights. His chest rose and fell in shallow, rapid breaths, his fingers twitching against his seams as he stood in the absolute silence of his own undoing. Near the doorway stood Elena, the quiet concierge who had watched the entire event unfold in the lobby. She was clutching a thick manila folder against her chest with both hands, her knuckles white against the cardboard. Her face was a complicated mask. There was anxiety there, a bone-deep worry for her own job security, but beneath it, there was a hard, quiet resolve. She had spent years watching people like Brandon and Gerald treat the lobby as their personal kingdom, and she had finally decided she was done watching. At the head of the table sat Julian Vance. He was not wearing a suit. He had on the same simple gray hoodie he had worn the night before, the cotton faded at the elbows, the cuffs slightly frayed. His worn jeans were dark and unexceptional, and his plain sneakers were dusted with the gray grime of a long transit. He looked entirely out of place in a room filled with four-figure suits and gold watches, yet his presence dominated the space with the heavy, unmovable weight of a mountain. He did not look at Gerald. He did not look at Brandon. His large, rough hands, calloused from years of physical labor before he ever owned a single brick of this hotel, were resting flat on the table. Between his palms sat a small, worn, stuffed rabbit. The rabbit, Barnaby, was missing most of its original plush loft. Its gray fabric was matted, its left ear hung by a few loose threads, and in place of its missing left eye, a black plastic button had been sewn on using heavy, deep blue upholstery thread. Julian's thumb moved slowly across the matted fur of the toy, a quiet, rhythmic gesture that was the only movement in the entire room. Gerald cleared his throat, the sound dry and raspy in the quiet. He tried to speak again, his voice cracking slightly on the first syllable. "Sir, if we had known it was you, if there had been any indication." Julian's hand stopped moving. He did not raise his voice. He did not look up. But when he spoke, the 6 executives in the row of chairs seemed to shrink back an inch. "You're still missing the point, Gerald." Julian's voice was low, carrying the quiet, heavy resonance of a stone dropping into a deep well. "You're still explaining why you would have treated me differently. I don't want to hear about me. I want to hear about the man who walked in here before you knew my name." The silence returned, heavier this time, pressing down on the room like a physical weight. The grandfather clock in the corner of the boardroom ticked, a slow, mechanical count that sounded like a hammer hitting an anvil. To understand how the flagship property of Vance Heritage Lodgings had ended up in this silent, terrifying boardroom, one had to look back. Not to the midnight arrival, and not to the phone call that broke the silence. One had to look back to the previous afternoon, to a moment when the rain was just beginning to fall, and the deep-seated rot of the Oak Ridge Vista was operating in broad daylight. The rain began at 7:15 on Wednesday evening, not with a sudden storm, but with a slow, cold drizzle that eventually turned the streets of the city into slick, black ribbons, reflecting the neon lights of the downtown district. By 7:30, the wind had picked up, driving the cold water in sheets against the massive glass entrance of the Oak Ridge Vista. Inside the lobby, the air was warm and perfumed. The scent of polished mahogany, fresh lilies, and expensive cologne drifted from the lounge, where a fire crackled quietly in a massive stone hearth. The lighting was low and golden, designed to make the wealthy travelers who crossed the threshold feel immediately insulated from the harshness of the street outside. Brandon stood behind the front desk, his hands resting flat on the dark wood. He was 28 years old, his hair styled with a precise, military parting, his uniform pristine. He took a slow breath, enjoying the quiet of the early evening shift. To Brandon, this lobby was not just a place of work. It was a theater where he performed a highly structured version of elite hospitality. He knew the name of every prominent guest arriving that week, their preferred room temperature, their favorite brand of sparkling water. He took pride in this knowledge, believing it elevated him above the ordinary staff who worked behind the scenes. But Brandon's definition of hospitality was highly selective. At 7:42, the revolving doors turned slowly. An elderly man stepped into the lobby, carrying a heavy, water-damaged cardboard box. He was a courier, 65 years old, his thin shoulders hunched under a wet nylon jacket that had seen too many winters. His boots were worn, leaving faint, damp tracks on the scuffed marble near the door. He stood there for a second, blinking against the bright, warm light of the chandeliers, looking lost. Brandon's warm, practiced smile vanished instantly. His jaw tightened, and his eyes traveled from the courier's damp boots to the water-dripping cardboard box, his expression carrying a quiet, clinical disgust. He did not greet the man. He did not ask how he could help him. He simply waited until the courier reached the counter, his hands resting flat on the wood like a barrier. "Delivery is at the back," Brandon said, his voice flat, his tone carrying the cold, dismissive cadence he reserved for people he decided did not belong in his lobby. The courier looked at him, his eyes tired, his skin lined with the deep-seated weariness of a lifetime of physical labor. He held the wet box a little tighter against his chest. "I'm sorry, sir," the courier said, his voice raspy. "The loading dock is locked, and the rain is coming down pretty hard. The paperwork said this had to go directly to the manager's office by 8. Brandon did not look at the paperwork. He did not look at the courier's face. He looked at the wet spot the cardboard box was leaving on the polished mahogany counter. "I don't care what the paperwork says," Brandon said, his voice dropping to a low, hard whisper. "You don't bring deliveries through the front entrance. Use the service alley around the back. Now." The courier hesitated, his hands trembling slightly under the weight of the box. He looked around the lobby, searching for another face, some sign of support, but there was none. At table 4 in the lounge, a wealthy couple in evening wear looked over, their eyes tracking the interaction with a brief, curious detachment before they returned to their wine. They didn't say anything. They didn't have to. The silent agreement of the room was already in place. The courier was an intrusion, a blemish on the perfect, expensive canvas of the Oak Ridge Vista, and Brandon was simply doing what he was paid to do, taking out the trash. Gerald, the regional supervisor, walked through the lobby at that exact moment. He was on his way to the lounge for a meeting, his dark wool coat draped over his arm, his gold watch catching the light as he adjusted his cuffs. He stopped near the desk, his eyes taking in the courier's wet jacket, the damp boots, the water-stained box on the mahogany. He didn't speak to the courier. He didn't ask Brandon what was happening. He simply gave Brandon a subtle, dismissive nod, a silent, structured signal they had used 100 times before to authorize the removal of anyone who didn't fit the hotel's aesthetic. "Make sure he uses the service elevator, Brandon," Gerald said, his voice smooth and untroubled as he adjusted his collar. "We have guests arriving." "Right away, sir," Brandon said, his smile returning as he looked at Gerald. He turned back to the courier, his face hardening once more. "You heard him. Service entrance. Around the back." The courier stood there for 3 seconds, his lips pressed together, his shoulders slumping. Then he turned, carrying his wet box, and walked back toward the revolving doors. His damp boots made a quiet, squeaking sound on the marble, a small, lonely noise that was quickly swallowed by the soft jazz playing from the lounge. Elena watched the entire interaction from the concierge desk. Her fingers were white-knuckled against the edge of the dark wood, her chest rising and falling in shallow, angry breaths. She knew the courier. His name was Thomas, and he had been delivering packages to this block for 7 years. He was a grandfather, a quiet man who always said "thank you, ma'am" when she signed his clipboard. She wanted to stand up. She wanted to walk over to the desk and tell Brandon that the service door was locked because the latch was broken and that the alley was currently flooding. She wanted to tell Gerald that Thomas had arthritis in his knees and that walking around the block in a freezing downpour was dangerous for a man his age. But she didn't move. She stayed in her chair, her eyes fixed on the computer screen in front of her, her fingers hovering over a keyboard she wasn't typing on. She thought about her rent, due in 5 days. She thought about her mother's medicine, which cost $240 a month and wasn't covered by the county plan. She thought about what had happened to the last receptionist who had argued with Gerald about operational standards. She chose silence, and that silence sat in her throat like a dry stone, taste-testing her own cowardice while the old man pushed through the revolving doors and back into the freezing rain. In the small, quiet room on the 4th floor of the Oak Ridge Vista, Julian Vance sat on the edge of the narrow single bed, his hands resting on his knees. The room was designed for staff or low-tier contractors. No marble, no mahogany, just a plain wooden desk, a single lamp with a yellowed shade, and a window that looked out over the gravel alley where the delivery trucks parked. He had checked in under his legal name, Julian Vance, but without his corporate title or his company credentials. The reservation had been processed by an automated system, and the staff had treated him as they treated any low-budget traveler who booked a room during the off-season. They gave him the room with the view of the gravel. He didn't mind. Julian had spent the first 30 years of his life looking at gravel. He had been born in a 3-room house in Knox Hollow, a mining town in West Virginia, where the dust from the coal tipple turned the creek water gray, and the trees looked like they had been sketched in charcoal. His father, Arthur Vance, had worked the night security shift at the Grand Hotel in the Valley, a massive stone resort where the wealthy families from Pittsburgh came to escape the summer heat. Arthur had been a tall man, his back bent from 22 years of carrying a heavy leather key ring and a flashlight along concrete corridors. Julian remembered the smell of his father's uniform when he came home at 6:30 inches the morning stale tobacco, wet wool, and the distinct, oily scent of the floor wax they used on the grand ballroom floors. Arthur would sit at the kitchen table in his undershirt, his hands calloused and gray at the knuckles, staring at his coffee cup without speaking. He was too tired to talk, too tired to play, too tired to do anything but sit in the quiet of his own exhaustion until the sun came up and he could finally sleep. But Arthur had never been bitter. "They don't see us, Julian," his father had told him once, his voice quiet and dry like gravel sliding down a chute. "When you're wearing the uniform, you're just part of the wall, like the wallpaper or the light fixtures. They look right through you to see their own reflection. You can't take it personal. That's just how the world is structured." Julian had taken it personal. He had promised himself, standing on the porch of that 3-room house, watching his father's hunched shoulders disappear into the early morning fog, that he would build a different kind of world. A company where the people who wore the uniforms were seen, where the people who swept the floors were known, and where the guests who arrived with nothing but a gray hoodie and a tired child were treated with the same bone-deep respect as the men with the gold watches. He had built that company. Vance Heritage Lodgings now owned 14 properties across the Southeast, but standing in this small yellow-lit room on the 4th floor, Julian wondered if he had built anything at all. He reached into his duffel bag and pulled out the small, stuffed rabbit, Barnaby. The toy had been a gift from his father on his 6th birthday. Arthur had found it in a vacant room after a wealthy family from Philadelphia had checked out. The family had left it behind because its left eye had been torn out and the gray fabric was stained with chocolate. They had bought their daughter a new one at the resort shop, leaving the old one in the wastebasket. Arthur had taken it home. He had spent 3 hours sitting under the single bulb in the kitchen, his thick, clumsy fingers working with a small needle, using heavy blue upholstery thread from his uniform repair kit to sew a black plastic button onto the rabbit's face. "He's not new, Julian," his father had said, handing him the toy with a hand that smelled of floor polish. "But he's clean, and he's got a new eye now. He can see things different." Julian touched the blue thread. It was still there, 26 years later, thick and coarse under his thumb. The rabbit had been his companion through the foster homes, after his father died, through the cold winters in Pittsburgh, through the long, sleepless years when he was building Vance Heritage from a single underperforming property in Charlotte. His mother, Margaret Williams, had died when he was 14. She had been an ER nurse, a woman who worked 16-hour shifts and spent her nights reading medical manuals to her son by the light of a kerosene lamp. Before she died, she had taken Julian's hands in hers and whispered, "The sky doesn't care what color you are, Julian, and neither does the earth. The only thing that matters is how you treat the people who can do nothing for you. Don't wait for the world to change. You change the room you're in." Julian closed his eyes, his thumb moving slowly across the matted fur of the rabbit's matted ear. He was in the room now, and tomorrow morning, he was going to see what kind of room he had built. The steel conveyor belt of the baggage claim carousel at Terminal 3 screeched to a halt, then groaned back to life with a mechanical shudder that vibrated through the concrete floor. It was 11:22 p.m. The air inside the terminal was thick, smelling of burnt jet fuel, floor wax, and the dry, recycled warmth of industrial heaters. Under the harsh, yellow-tinted overhead lights, travelers moved with a slow, heavy drag, their faces shadowed by exhaustion, their movements stiff from hours spent in narrow cabin seats. Julian Vance stood near the edge of the belt. His dark jeans were stiff, and his gray cotton hoodie was damp around the shoulders from the brief run through the wet parking garage in Charlotte earlier that evening. He did not move with the hurried, anxious rush of the other passengers. He stood entirely still, his large frame anchored to the floor. Against his chest, 7-year-old Lily was a warm, heavy weight. Her head was tucked into the crook of his shoulder, her soft hair tickling his collarbone under his chin. With every breath she took, her chest rose and fell in a slow, rhythmic pattern that Julian monitored with the ingrained, instinctual vigilance of a parent who had raised his child alone since her infancy. In her small, sleeping hand, she clutched Barnaby the rabbit. The toy was pressed tight against her ribs, the single black button eye sewn with Arthur's coarse blue upholstery thread catching the yellow glare of the terminal lights. The blue thread stood out in sharp relief against the worn, faded gray fabric of the rabbit's face, a tiny, physical monument to a grandfather's long night labor carried across states and continents, never leaving the child's side. Julian watched the last few suitcases slide down the metal chute, their heavy leather and plastic bodies thudding against the steel rim of the carousel. He reached down with his free hand, his calloused fingers wrapping around the handle of their single canvas duffel bag. The bag was old, its black canvas faded to a dusty gray, its zipper held together at the end by a small loop of wire. It did not carry the prestigious monogram of the luggage belonging to the passengers who had occupied the front of the aircraft. It was a bag meant for utility, a bag that carried his father's old habit of traveling light and expecting nothing. Julian looked down at Lily. Her eyelashes were long, casting soft, feathery shadows on her cheeks. Her breathing was deep, her small lips slightly parted, completely untroubled by the screech of the luggage belts or the announcements echoing from the terminal ceiling. The drive from the airport to their house in the Northern Hills was 45 minutes along a winding, unlit 2-lane highway. Julian felt the dull, throbbing ache in his lower back. The physical cost of 3 months spent auditing properties in Europe, of sleeping on narrow train berths, and walking miles of hotel corridors. To attempt that drive in this condition, with a sleeping child in his arms, felt like a reckless gamble he was not willing to take. The decision came quietly, without debate. He would stop at the Oak Ridge Vista. It was the flagship property of Vance Heritage Lodgings, located only 10 minutes from the airport terminal. Julian had not seen the property in 4 months. He had not called ahead to Jeffrey Thorne, his chief executive, nor had he alerted Gerald, the regional supervisor. He did not want a performance. He did not want the staff to polish the brass and straighten their ties for his arrival. He wanted to walk in as a tired father with a sleeping child, to experience the hotel exactly as any ordinary, weary traveler would at midnight. He lifted the canvas duffel bag, the strap settling over his right shoulder, and adjusted Lily's weight with his left arm. She let out a small, warm sigh against his neck, her fingers tightening slightly around Barnaby's worn ear. "I've got you, baby," Julian whispered, his voice a low, heavy rumble that she felt more than heard. He turned toward the exit, his plain sneakers squeaking softly on the polished terminal tiles as he walked out into the cold, wet night. The cold rain had turned into a steady, freezing mist by the time Julian reached the front entrance of the Oak Ridge Vista. The Grand Hotel rose into the wet darkness like a monument of limestone and glass, its exterior uplights casting a soft, theatrical glow over the manicured boxwood hedges and the circular driveway. Julian pushed through the heavy glass revolving doors. The transition was immediate, a physical wave of warmth and luxury. The air inside the grand lobby smelled of rich mahogany oil, fresh-cut white lilies, and the faint, expensive scent of sandalwood and leather. The ceiling rose 30 feet above, supported by massive columns of polished Italian marble that reflected the soft golden light of 3 enormous baccarat chandeliers. The grand lobby was designed to feel like an insulated sanctuary, a world where the noise and the cold of the street could not penetrate. Julian had spent 11 years designing and building this environment. Every detail, from the specific weave of the custom wool carpets to the low golden temperature of the lighting, had been approved by his hand. He had built this place to be a home for those who had none, a space where dignity was the standard, not an option. But as he stepped onto the custom carpet, his plain sneakers sinking slightly into the wool, he felt the immediate, silent friction of the room. Behind the long front desk of dark polished mahogany, Brandon stood alone. He was 28 years old, his hair styled with a precise, razor-sharp parting, his navy blue uniform jacket pressed to a crisp, unyielding edge. He was occupied with his monitor, his fingers tapping the keys with a quick, professional efficiency. When the revolving doors turned, Brandon looked up, his smile already half-formed, a trained, automatic reflex of hospitality. But the moment his eyes registered Julian, the smile froze. It was a subtle, visceral shift, a micro-expression of immediate judgment that Julian recognized instantly. Brandon's eyes did not look at Julian's face. They traveled down, scanning the faded gray cotton of the hoodie, the dark, unbranded jeans, the worn sneakers with the small hole near the left toe, and the canvas duffel bag held together by wire. Finally, they lingered on Lily, on her sleeping face, her matted hair, and the worn stuffed rabbit clutched in her hand. In Brandon's world, people who looked like Julian did not check into the Oak Ridge Vista. They did not belong on the Italian marble. They did not sit under the baccarat chandeliers. They belonged in the service alley, or the cheap motels near the interstate, or the shelters downtown. The judgment was instantaneous, bone-deep, and entirely silent. To Julian's right, Elena sat behind the concierge desk. She was 24, her hair pulled back into a neat, tight bun, her uniform identical to Brandon's. She had been organizing brochures, but her hands went completely still as Julian stepped toward the front counter. She looked at Julian, then her eyes flicked to Brandon. Then she looked at her desk, her jaw tightening. She remembered the previous evening, the elderly courier standing in the rain, the way Gerald had nodded, and the quiet, heavy shame that had sat in her throat. She felt that same shame rising now, a cold, dry weight that made her fingers grip the edge of her desk until her knuckles turned white. She wanted to stand up, but her legs felt heavy, anchored to the floor by her own fear. Near the lounge bar, 2 men in expensive, tailored blazers paused their conversation. They set their glasses down, their eyes tracking Julian's movement with a quiet, detached curiosity. They didn't say anything, but their silence carried the same weight as Brandon's stare. The lobby had become a theater, and Julian was the intrusion. Julian walked to the mahogany counter. He did not lower his eyes. He did not adjust his hoodie. He stood before Brandon, his large, rough hand resting flat on the dark wood, and waited. The silence between the two men at the mahogany desk was thick and cold, a physical barrier that seemed to expand with every second. Brandon did not offer a greeting. He did not say good evening. He simply stood with his hands flat on his side of the counter, his chin lifted, his eyes holding a calculated, professional distance. "I need a standard double room for tonight," Julian said. His voice was low, carrying the quiet, heavy weight of a rock, pitched to avoid disturbing the sleeping girl on his shoulder. "One night, just my daughter and me." Brandon did not look at his monitor. He did not tap his keyboard. He kept his eyes fixed on Julian's face, his expression carrying a quiet, structured condescension. "Sir," Brandon said, his voice dropping to a low, smooth whisper that was designed to sound discreet while still carrying to the nearby tables. "This isn't the kind of place you can just walk into." The phrase was a fence, a polite, structured microaggression designed to establish a boundary without using a single vulgar word. It was the language of an elite gatekeeper, the kind of language Brandon had practiced until it felt like his own. Julian did not flinch. His hand stayed flat on the dark wood, his large, rough fingers steady. "I'm asking for a room," Julian said, his voice unchanged, his eyes holding Brandon's with an unblinking, unmovable focus. "A standard double. If you have one, process it." Brandon's nostrils flared slightly. He did not like the lack of fear. He was used to people in gray hoodies looking down, apologizing for their intrusion, and moving toward the exit. This man was standing like a wall, his quiet presence forcing Brandon to justify a decision he had already made. "I'm sorry, sir," Brandon said, his voice hardening slightly, his fingers casually playing with 2 keycards on the counter. "We're fully booked tonight. No availability. If you'd like, I can find you something closer to the highway. There are several budget motels that might suit your needs." He said the word budget with a quiet, lingering emphasis, his eyes flicking to the canvas duffel bag on Julian's shoulder. Beside Julian, Lily stirred. Her head moved slightly against his gray hoodie, her soft, warm hair brushing his neck. Her small hand tightened around Barnaby the rabbit, the matted fur of the toy pressed against Julian's chest. The yellow light of the desk lamp caught the black button eye of the rabbit and the coarse blue thread of Arthur's stitches, a small, clean visual that stood out in sharp, quiet contrast against the dark luxury of the mahogany desk. From the concierge desk, Elena watched Brandon's fingers play with the key cards. She knew he was lying. She had the room availability log open on her own monitor. There were 14 vacant rooms on the 3rd and 4th floors, including 3 standard doubles that had been held for late arrivals. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, rapid breaths. She looked at Julian, at his calloused hand on the counter, at the sleeping child holding the worn toy, and she felt the memory of her own father's worn hands, a man who had worked 30 years in the steel mills, who had been treated exactly like this in every bank and hotel he had ever entered. She wanted to speak up. She wanted to call out Brandon's lie in front of the lobby. But she looked at the door to the back office, where Gerald's shadow was visible through the frosted glass. She remembered her rent. She remembered her mother's medicine. Her fingers stayed flat on her desk, her knuckles white, her mouth closed. Brandon slid his hands into his pockets, leaning back slightly, his face settling into a mask of polite, unyielding finality. "We have no room, sir," Brandon said. "I'll have to ask you to leave." Julian looked at him for 3 seconds. He did not raise his voice. He did not move. He simply held the clerk's gaze, with the quiet, terrible focus of a man who was recording everything he saw. "Then call your manager," Julian said. The heavy glass revolving doors of the Oak Ridge Vista turned again with a soft, pneumatic hiss, bringing with them a sudden draft of cold night air and the crisp, clean scent of rain-soaked wool and expensive leather. A wealthy, middle-aged couple walked into the lobby. The man wore a tailored charcoal blazer over a cashmere sweater, his leather loafers dry and immaculate, while the woman beside him wore an elegant trench coat that fell in soft, heavy folds to her ankles. They moved with the unhurried, comfortable confidence of people who had spent their entire lives walking into grand spaces and expecting the world to adjust to their arrival. "We just landed, and the highway is a total mess," the man said, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet marble floor. "We don't have a reservation, but we need a room for the night. Something quiet." Brandon's entire posture transformed in a single, fluid second. His shoulders lifted, his hands came out of his pockets, and a warm, genuine smile lit up his face. The cold, dismissive gatekeeper who had just stood before Julian vanished, replaced instantly by the elite hospitality professional who knew exactly how to make wealth feel welcomed. "Welcome to the Oak Ridge Vista, sir," Brandon said, his voice dropping to a smooth, deferential tone that carried not a hint of the flat condescension he had used moments earlier. "I completely understand about the weather. Let me see what I can do for you. We have a few premium suites available on the executive floor tonight." He began tapping his keyboard with rapid, enthusiastic efficiency, his eyes bright as he interacted with the couple. Within 4 minutes, the transaction was complete. The couple's credit card was processed, their names were registered, and Brandon handed over 2 gold-embossed keycards with a warm, respectful bow of his head. "You're in Suite 412, sir," Brandon said. "The elevator is just past the lounge on your right. If you need anything at all, please don't hesitate to let me know." "Thank you, Brandon," the man said, taking the keys and turning toward the elevators. They walked past Julian without a glance, their leather soles clicking softly on the marble, completely unaware of the quiet drama they had just stepped through. Julian Vance stood 3 feet away from the desk, his gray hoodie still damp around the shoulders, his left arm supporting the sleeping Lily. He watched the entire transaction in absolute, motionless silence. His large, rough hand stayed flat on the dark wood, his knuckles steady. He did not speak. He did not interrupt. He simply watched the gold keycard slide across the polished mahogany, a silent, indisputable proof of the structured exclusion operating inside his flagship hotel. The lobby guests had gone quiet. At the lounge bar, the bartender stopped wiping a glass, the white cloth held tight in his hand as he watched the scene at the counter. The couple who had been sitting near the fireplace had turned their heads, their eyes tracking the contrast between Julian's worn sneakers and the wealthy couple's tailored loafers. The air in the lobby was thick, filled with the quiet, uncomfortable tension of people who knew they were witnessing something deeply unfair, but chose the safety of their own silence. Elena sat behind her concierge desk, her chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid breaths. She looked at the gold key cards on the counter, then at Julian's calm, unblinking face, and then at her own monitor. Her screen still showed the room availability log, 14 vacant rooms, including the very suite Brandon had just processed for a walk-in couple. She felt a cold, dry weight press down on her chest. The silent rot of the department wasn't a mistake. It was an ingrained, structured policy that protected the comfortable and discarded the weary. And she was standing right in the middle of it, her hands flat against her desk, her mouth closed by her own fear. The door to the back office opened, and Gerald, the regional supervisor, stepped onto the marble floor of the lobby. He was 45 years old, his silver-flecked hair parted with a precise, razor-sharp edge, his tailored navy suit fitting him like armor. He carried himself with the rigid, heavy authority of a man who believed his status was absolute, his gold watch catching the golden light of the baccarat chandeliers as he adjusted his cuffs. "Brandon," Gerald said, his voice smooth and untroubled as he approached the front desk. "Is there a problem here?" Brandon leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low, urgent whisper as he summarized the situation. His fingers tapped the mahogany counter, pointing discreetly toward Julian's gray hoodie and the sleeping child. "Sir, he's asking for a room, but we don't have availability for walk-ins of his." "Description," Brandon whispered, using the coded language of their shared policy. "I've asked him to leave, but he's refusing to move." Gerald turned his head slowly, his eyes taking in Julian's worn sneakers, the canvas duffel bag, and the sleeping Lily holding Barnaby the rabbit. His face didn't show anger, just a cold, clinical detachment. He adjusted his collar and stepped closer to Julian, positioning himself in a way that made the geometry of the situation obvious. Two uniformed representatives of authority on one side, a quiet man in a gray hoodie on the other. "Sir," Gerald said, his voice flat and professional, carrying the distinct, polite arrogance of a man who believed his position protected him from any challenge. "My staff has already explained our policy. We are fully booked tonight. We cannot accommodate you." Julian looked at him. His large, rough hand stayed flat on the counter. His voice came out low and heavy, carrying the weight of a stone. "Your staff just booked a suite for a walk-in couple 3 minutes ago," Julian said. "I watched them hand over the keys. I'm asking you to explain why they received a room and I didn't." Gerald's nostrils flared slightly. He didn't like the directness of the question. He was used to people of Julian's apparent class backing down, accepting the exclusion, and moving quietly toward the door. This man was standing like a wall, his quiet presence forcing Gerald to justify a lie. "Our staff exercised their professional judgment based on our occupancy standards," Gerald said, his voice smooth and dismissive. "I stand behind that judgment. We are under no obligation to explain our booking procedures to you. Now, I must ask you to leave our lobby." "And if I don't?" Julian asked. Gerald's jaw tightened. He looked at the security desk near the entrance, then back at Julian, his eyes holding a cold, calculated finality. "If you refuse to leave," Gerald said, his voice dropping to a hard, low whisper, "I will have security escort you out. I don't want a scene in front of our guests, but I will do what is necessary to protect the reputation of this property." Julian did not move. He did not raise his voice. He simply held Gerald's gaze with a steady, unyielding focus that made the manager's collar feel suddenly tight. Elena sat behind her concierge desk, her hands flat against the mahogany, her fingers trembling. She could hear every word of the confrontation. The lobby was so quiet that even the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner sounded like a slow, heavy hammer hitting an anvil. She looked at Julian. She looked at Lily's small, sleeping face, her fingers still wrapped around Barnaby's matted ear. The blue thread of the rabbit's eye caught the light, a tiny, silent reminder of Arthur's long night labor. Elena felt a cold, dry weight press down on her throat. She remembered her father's hands rough, calloused, and gray at the knuckles, just like Julian's. She remembered the day they had been turned away from a restaurant in the northern suburbs because they didn't meet the dress code. She remembered the quiet, heavy shame on her father's face, the way he had looked at his shoes and walked back to their old sedan without a word. She had promised herself then, a 12-year-old girl sitting in the passenger seat of that rusted car, that she would never let anyone feel that way if she could help it. And now, she was sitting behind a mahogany desk, her uniform pristine, her salary paid by the very company that was currently dragging a father and his child out of the lobby. Gerald turned toward the security desk and gave a short, sharp nod. 2 security guards stepped onto the marble floor. They were both large men, their navy uniforms identical, their movements slow and patient. They had parked their patrol car in the alley earlier, and their boots made a heavy, rhythmic sound on the marble as they walked toward Julian's chair. Elena watched them move. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, rapid breaths. She looked at her phone sitting on her desk, the screen dark, her hand hovering over it. She thought about her rent. She thought about her mother's medicine. She thought about the 31 Glassdoor reviews she had read, all of them describing the same cold, dismissive treatment of low-status guests. "If you speak up, you're gone," the previous receptionist had told her. Gerald doesn't want people who ask questions. He wants people who follow the system. The system. Elena looked at Lily. The child had stirred, her eyelashes fluttering as she adjusted her weight against her father's shoulder. She looked so small, so completely innocent of the cold, structured cruelty operating around her. Elena made her choice. She reached out, her fingers trembling as she grabbed her personal phone. She did not hold it up like a camera. She did not make a production of it. She slowly slid it onto her lap, screen facing outward toward the front desk, and pressed the red record button on her voice memo app. The red dot began to blink silently in the dark. The lobby guests had gone completely still. The bartender had set his glass down, his hands flat on the bar, his eyes locked on the two security guards closing in on Julian. The couple near the fireplace had stood up, their eyes wide as they watched the confrontation. "Sir, you need to step away from the desk," the first guard said, his voice low and firm as he stopped 2 feet from Julian. Julian did not move. He did not look at the guard. He kept his eyes on Gerald's face. "I'm waiting for the manager to explain why a walk-in couple received a room and I didn't," Julian said, his voice a low, heavy rock. "I've already given you my answer," Gerald said, his voice sharp and cold. "Now, officers, escort him out." The phone in Elena's lap kept recording, the small red dot pulsing in the dark, capturing every word, every breath, every silent step of the system at work. Lily's eyelashes fluttered against Julian's gray hoodie, and she came back to consciousness with the sudden, quiet alertness that only children possess. Her small green eyes, bright and entirely free of sleep, blinked against the golden glare of the baccarat chandeliers. She looked at the 2 large security guards standing on either side of her father's chair. She looked at Gerald, whose arms were still crossed, his jaw tight. She looked at the front desk, where Brandon stood behind the mahogany counter. She did not cry. She did not cling to Julian's neck. She simply sat up straighter, clutching Barnaby the rabbit to her chest, her fingers tracing the coarse blue upholstery thread of his grandfather's stitches. She looked at Gerald, her voice clear, carrying the unhurried, devastating simplicity of an innocent child. "Why are you making us leave?" she asked. "If they don't want us here, why do they work here? Isn't their job to help people?" The room went completely silent. It was a physical, choking silence that settled over the marble floor like a cold mist. At the lounge bar, the businessman who had set his glass down stared at his feet, his cheeks flushing red. The guard on Julian's left took half a step back, his shoulders slumping slightly as his eyes dropped to the floor. Gerald's face went rigid, his nostrils flaring, his collar suddenly feeling far too tight. The simple, raw logic of the question had pierced through 20 years of his polished corporate defense, leaving him with nothing to say. Julian looked down at his daughter. His expression did not show anger, just a quiet, deep-seated pride. He smoothed her hair gently with his large, rough hand. "You didn't do anything wrong, Lily," he said, his voice a low, heavy rock. "Not one thing." He pulled his phone from his gray hoodie pocket, dialed a number, and brought it to his ear. The line rang twice before the chief executive officer of Vance Heritage Lodgings, Jeffrey Thorne, answered. Julian spoke 4 quiet, precise sentences. "Jeffrey, I am in the lobby of the Oak Ridge Vista. I have my daughter Lily with me. Your staff has refused us a room and is currently having security escort us out. I need you to come down to the lobby right now." He hung up, slid the phone back into his pocket, and stood quietly. For 3 minutes, the lobby was suspended in a fragile, suffocating silence. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked, a slow, heavy count that seemed to hammer away at the remaining confidence in Brandon and Gerald's faces. An uneasy, creeping dread was beginning to settle over the desk. Brandon's fingers, which had been playing with the key cards, went completely still on the mahogany counter. Gerald adjusted his cuffs twice, his movements hurried, his eyes darting toward the elevator doors. The elevator at the far end of the lobby chimed. The glass doors slid open, and Jeffrey Thorne stepped out onto the marble floor, flanked by 2 vice presidents of operations. His silver hair was slightly unkempt, his dark wool suit unbuttoned, his tie loose around his neck as if he had dressed in a matter of seconds. He walked across the custom wool carpet with a rapid, unhurried urgency that made every head in the room turn. He did not look at Gerald. He did not look at Brandon. He walked straight to Julian Vance. Jeffrey stopped 2 feet from the man in the gray hoodie, his back straight, his eyes holding a profound, quiet shame. "Mr. Vance," Jeffrey said, his voice carrying the distinct, heavy resonance of a formal apology. "I am deeply sorry you were kept waiting. We had no idea you were arriving tonight." The silence in the room didn't just hold. It detonated. Gerald's face went the color of old, damp plaster. His arms dropped to his sides, his chest rising and falling in shallow, panicked breaths as his eyes darted from Jeffrey to the simple gray hoodie Julian was wearing. His knees shook slightly, and his fingers twitched against his trousers as he realized the exact size of the mistake he had just made. The man he had called a blemish, the man he had ordered thrown onto the street, was the owner of the very building he stood in. Beside him, Brandon looked like he had been struck by a physical blow. His hands, still flat on the mahogany desk, were trembling. His lips turned a dry, pale gray, and his knuckles went bone-white against the wood as he stared at the gold nameplate Foster on Julian's portfolio. The unyielding, polished gatekeeper who had ruled the lobby since midnight had shrunk into a shadow. Julian did not raise his voice. He stood beside the chaise, his hand still resting on Lily's shoulder, his quiet presence dominating the grand room. "You're fired, Gerald," Julian said. He did not look at the manager's face. "Your supervisor contract is terminated effective immediately. We'll have HR process your departure in the morning. No severance." Gerald's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Julian turned to Brandon. "And you, Brandon, you're not leaving the company yet, but starting Monday, you're working the night security shift on the basement levels, the same shift my father worked for 22 years. You'll wear the uniform, you'll carry the keys, and you'll learn what it feels like to be invisible. If you can do that with humility, we'll talk about your future. If not, the exit is behind you." He turned to Elena, who was still standing behind the concierge desk, her personal phone clutched in her hand. "Elena," Julian said, his voice softening by 1 degree, "you're our new guest services manager. I watched you tonight. You saw the line, and you chose to stand near it even when the system made it hard. I need people behind that desk who know what dignity actually looks like." Elena's eyes filled with tears, but she did not let them fall. She straightened her spine and handed her phone across the counter. "I recorded everything, Captain," she said quietly. For the record, Julian took the phone, his calloused fingers wrapping around the plastic. "Thank you, Elena," he said. 3 months later, the early afternoon sun came through the grand glass windows of the Oak Ridge Vista, painting the Italian marble floor in long, warm patterns of pink and gold. The scent of lilies and polished mahogany still filled the air, but the quiet, defensive tension that had once sat in the corners of the lobby was gone, replaced by a soft, welcoming warmth that reached every chair. Elena stood behind the front desk, her guest services manager badge polished and bright. An old, travel-worn family pushed through the revolving doors. 2 parents, their clothes wrinkled and cheap, carrying 3 battered suitcases held together by tape, and a tired little boy dragging a heavy backpack. They stood at the counter, their eyes low, looking like people who expected to be told they did not belong. Elena did not look at their luggage. She did not look at their shoes. She stepped around the counter, knelt to the little boy's level, and offered him a warm, genuine smile. "Welcome to the Oak Ridge Vista," she said, her voice clear and kind. "Let me help you with that bag. We have a beautiful room waiting for you." The parents' shoulders relaxed, their faces softening as they realized they had finally reached a safe harbor. In the corner of the lobby, Julian and Lily sat on the blue velvet chaise. Lily was clutching Barnaby the rabbit, her fingers resting on the coarse blue upholstery thread of the grandfather's stitches. She watched Elena guide the family toward the elevator, her green eyes bright and content. Julian watched them go. He took a sip of his black coffee, set the cup down, and reached for his daughter's hand. He had built this house, and now, finally, it was a home. The memories of the long night shifts and the quiet, heavy shame of the past had not disappeared, but they had been built into a foundation of unyielding, widespread respect. The old, structured barriers of the hotel were gone, replaced by the everyday commitment of a team that had learned to see past the gray hoodies of the world. In the quiet of the grand lobby, under the light of the baccarat chandeliers, the descendants of the night shift were finally the ones holding the keys. If this story reminded you of the quiet dignity of those whom the world so often chooses to ignore, please take a moment to share it with someone who needs to hear it today. We invite you to join our journey of uncovering the extraordinary talent hidden in the plainest places by showing your support for our channel. Your simple click helps us continue telling these important stories of justice, awakening, and the quiet truth that the sky belongs to everyone.